Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shireen Ash. I'm a librarian at the Marin County Free Library, typically based at the Corte Madera branch. I'm excited today to share a wonderful presentation by naturalist Shannon Burke. She works for the Marin County Parks as an interpretive naturalist. She's given many programs for me before. You'll find her a knowledgeable and exciting speaker, so I know you will appreciate this program. The program will run from 1:35 as we're starting now till at 2:30. Everyone, please stay mute during the presentation. There'll be time for questions after Shannon's done speaking. You can put your questions in the chat and I will read them out. If you need to follow up with questions or learn more about the county parks, I'll be putting their web address in the chat and you can view it then. As I mentioned, we will be recording this program, so you'll be able to view it on the Marin County Free Library YouTube channel or on the county parks website. So you can refer to it to remind yourself what you've learned or share it with friends. So with that, I'm going to ask Shannon to appear and share her wonderful slide deck with us. So thank you all for joining us, and I'll see you back at Q&A time.
Okay, hi everyone. Just to make sure you can see me, right, Shireen?
Yes, we can see you just fine, and I'm going to disappear until the Q&A.
Okay, great.
Slides look fine, by the way.
Wonderful. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is exciting to be doing this. First, I just want to thank Shireen for reaching out and coordinating this and the Corte Madera Library. It's funny, I was scheduled to do this presentation in person, I think about 2 weeks after the shutdown started. So it's really nice to kind of come full circle and be getting back to it, especially as things are beginning to ease up. And on that note, I do want to mention that personally for me, this is exciting news, hopefully for some other people. I'm going to start leading naturalist walks again, probably in late June. So check out our website and go to the events calendar if you have any interest in checking out the in-person walks. So today we're going to be talking about bird vocalizations. So birds vocalize throughout the year, and they give a various array of different vocalizations. But we kind of become more conscious of it at this time of year because songbirds really begin to vocalize a lot during the spring and summer. So the first thing to think about is the difference between calls and songs, and a couple things to think about. So calls are succinct. They are brief, and in some cases, it's just one note. They are innate. So these aren't songs that these aren't calls that need to be learned. Birds are born knowing how to use these vocalizations. It's kind of equivalent to a human laugh or scream. And sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time disappearing my thing so that I could see my whole screen. Anyway, both sexes give, sorry for 1 second. I can't see my whole screen. Anyway, so both sexes give calls and they are given all year round. So why do birds call? One of the main reasons is to maintain contact. So that might be in the wintertime between different flock members. A lot of species come together as flocks during the wintertime. And then even on migration, especially some birds that migrate at night, they will actually vocalize as they're migrating together and track of each other. And then also you get contact calls between pairs. And then once the young have fledged, the parents will kind of keep the family together with contact calls. You also get solicitation calls, which basically are the young begging for food. And then during courtship, females will actually solicit from the males. And so the males will feed the females in response to sort of begging. And I think of it as kind of a practice run for when they actually have young, and also for when the females are incubating and sitting on the nest, incubating eggs, and then the male will feed her during that time. And then also birds will have aggression calls. And a lot of times that can help sort of settle a dispute between two different birds so that they don't actually have to have physical contact. And so birds call to sound the alarm. So a lot of birds have what's called a zeep call, and it's this very high-pitched call that sort of starts off softly and then it gets louder and then it fades away. And so it's very fast. It's just this little sheep. And so that's given in response typically to, say, a hawk that's flying overhead. And different species will give a similar alarm call. And so all of the birds in the area will know to either freeze where they are or to basically dive and take cover. And one thing about the sound of that call is that it's hard for the hawk to actually identify where the individual is that gave that call. Opposed to that are harsher sounds that some birds make, and they do what's called mobbing. And so let's say there's a hawk or an owl that comes into an area, or a bird discovers that it's perched there. And so it might sound the alarm by actually being really, really loud and drawing attention to where the predator is. And then different species might join in. And so you can get this cacophony of sound, just all of these birds kind of screaming their heads off. And so that's referred to as mobbing. And there are a few different thoughts as to why birds might do that. One is to distract the predator from the, basically, if the adult bird is distracting the predator, then it doesn't have a chance to look for the vulnerable young. Another thing is to alert a mate or offspring that there's a predator in the area. And then even to basically let the predator know that these birds are onto it, right? So let's say that there's an owl like this great horned owl. And if a bunch of birds start vocalizing and sometimes diving on it, then that predator knows, that owl knows, like, hey, I've been seen, I'm not going to be able to sneak up on anyone, I might as well just get out of here. And then there's also a thought that perhaps it could even help to alert a larger predator of the presence of a smaller predator. And then in that way, the predators can kind of work it out amongst themselves. Okay, so calls versus songs. So then compared to calls, how do you explain songs? So songs are typically more complex. As I said, calls are frequently just one note. Songs typically are more than that. Sometimes it's a lot of notes strung together. Sometimes it might even just be a couple notes or one note, but it's consistently repeated, and that might be that species song. Songs are, for the most part, they're learned rather than being innate. And in the temperate regions, typically it's the males that are the most predominant singers. We do have some females that sing, and we'll get to that later. But in tropical areas, both the males and the females usually sing. Okay, so when do birds sing? So we have these annual patterns. As I mentioned at the beginning, things are kind of, we're in the midst of the season when birds are really making a lot of noise these days. And so they typically sing more during the breeding season, and that usually is in the spring and summer. And then you also get these daily patterns. So you get what's called the dawn chorus or the morning chorus. And that is kind of this explosion of sound, and the sun comes up, or just before the sun comes up, a lot of birds start vocalizing. And it's sort of a way of advertising, like, hey, I'm here. And then if there are any females that are looking for mates, they can, begin moving around and finding those males. And then at the end of the day, you usually get another surge of sound. And I like to think of this as sort of the lullaby at the end of the day. But it's probably a way for birds to sort of reestablish that they're still on territory, that they've made it through the day, that they got enough food to eat and all of this. And so you get these daily patterns as well. But then birds, especially at the height of the breeding season, you will still hear birds singing sometimes during the day as well. Okay, so how do birds know that it's time to start singing? How do they know that spring is here? So this happens with the increase in day length. So as we move out of winter time, the days start to get longer. And typically somewhere around when the days start to hit 10 or 11 hours, that's enough daylight to sort of trigger these responses in a lot of different birds. And one thing to keep in mind is as those days get longer, it means that plants are growing more. So there's more plant material, which might include seeds and, just if some birds are eating kind of fresh little green sprouts and things like that. And then also with that, you get an increase in insects and rodents and all of this. So there's just more abundance of food as the days get longer. And so what happens is the sun, the rays from the sun actually penetrate the skull of the bird, and it ends up sort of stimulating the hypothalamus, which is sort of deep in the brain. And then the hypothalamus releases hormones that then trigger the pituitary gland to release hormones, that then trigger the gonads to release hormones. And then you just get this sort of positive feedback loop, this cascade of hormones that triggers things. And part of those things are these physiological changes that occur within the birds. So in some cases, you might get a different plumage. So in the spring, some birds might molt their body feathers and go from being rather drab in the wintertime to really bright in the springtime. So here is a goldfinch, a male goldfinch. And on the left, this is what he would look like during the wintertime. And on the right, this is breeding plumage. So you get this bright yellow, you get that nice black cap. And then also note that the bill has a different color. So the bare parts can change color, and that includes the bill, the legs, and the feet, and sometimes the skin right around the eye. So you see here, it's got that nice sort of pink-orange bill during the breeding season. And then also, birds will develop what's called a brood patch. And so this is a featherless area on the underside, and that is used for incubating eggs. So basically, it's just a way that the birds can transfer their body heat more easily to the eggs that they're sitting on. And in some species, the females are the primary incubators. So they might develop a brood patch and the male might not. In some species, both the male and female take turns incubating, and so they both develop that. And in some cases, like for instance, phalaropes, where the males predominantly are the ones who are incubating eggs, the male might develop that and the females won't. So it just kind of depends on the species and who's doing all of the incubating. Okay, so with those physiological changes come behavioral changes. So if you have a migratory species that might be down south in the wintertime, as the days get longer, it triggers an impulse to migrate. So all of a sudden, they need to start heading back to the breeding territory or the breeding areas so that they can establish territories. In a lot of cases, the males are moving first ahead of the females so that they can get on the breeding ground and start to establish territories. And then they start to sing. And once the females show up, they respond to that. And then courtship starts, and again, this hormonal increase ends up affecting that and triggering courtship and these other behaviors. Okay, so why do birds sing? So as a male, like for instance, this lazuli bunting, this beautiful bird, starts to establish a territory, it kind of might go through these chases, and the males might chase each other, and you might have these scuffles as they're all settling in. And then finally, they kind of settle down and start to define their territories. And so some birds, like the buntings, will have several different perches within their territory that they'll sing from. So he might fly to the top of one tree, sing for a little while, fly to another tree, sing for a little while, fly to another tree and sing for a little while. And so over time, he's kind of drawing a line around his particular territory. And then singing also helps attract mates. So when the females show up, they are looking for males. So they're looking to see if a male is around. And then they also can sort of begin to, in a way, judge the male's physical wellness and well-being and strength and all of this from his song. And we'll talk more about that in a second. And then also in some cases, singing can help stimulate the female. So basically it can in turn trigger sort of responses, courtship responses in her. And so it helps with the pair bonding and courtship and copulation. Okay, so there's also this great benefit to singing, and with species where you have a lot of males that their territories might be close to each other, sometimes you get birds that are sharing songs. So for instance, song sparrows, a male might have about 8 to 10 songs in his repertoire, and those are his songs that he sings all the time, and so he might cycle through those. But there have been studies done that show that frequently one male might share at least 2 songs with a neighbor, and that ends up being really beneficial. So you can have an area, and if those males are sharing songs within that sort of neighborhood, it actually helps to decrease any sort of physical confrontations that they get into. So let's say you've got, Sam over here, he's singing his song, and his neighbor Joe shares 2 songs with him. And on the other side of Sam is Bill, and Sam and Bill share 2 songs as well. So throughout the breeding season, they can sort of keep tabs on each other, recognize each other, realize like, yeah, we figured out our boundaries and we've all settled in and everything's good. But if a different male comes in that doesn't share a song, that sort of lets these birds within that area know that there's an interloper, as it were. And so then they can be a little bit more on guard. And studies have shown that in song sparrows, in populations where males share songs, they live twice as long as those that don't share songs. So it actually really helps them to not expend a lot of energy sort of getting into fights or having to defend their territory and all of that. So in the long run, it really pays off to be neighborly and share songs. Okay, so how do birds sing? So if you look at deep inside of a bird's chest, you would find what's called a syrinx. And this is where the trachea comes down, and then it branches into these 2 sort of channels that ultimately lead to the lungs. But this is this incredibly complex organ, and it has very delicate cartilage, and it has membranes, and it has muscular control. And this is where the sound is produced in birds. And the interesting thing is on the left side, that channel produces a lower sound, a lower pitch, a lower frequency. And then on the right side, it's higher. So birds are actually capable of producing 2 different notes at the same time. And in some cases, this is really quite complex. So in thrushes, like the hermit thrush here on the left, they have this, if anybody's familiar with their song, they're just beautiful. Hermit thrushes and Swainson thrushes have their local birds, and they have, I think, really beautiful songs. They're very flute-like, and they're just sort of this ethereal sounding song. And so what's going on there is they're capable of producing rising and falling notes simultaneously. And then other birds can really quickly shift volume and pitch from those 2 different sides. And so birds like European starlings can actually make that shift 100 times faster than the human blink of an eye. So that's incredibly fast. So these are just these really complex feats that they're accomplishing. And in fact, bird songs are some of the most acoustically complex sounds in nature. Okay, so does more mean more? If a bird is capable of singing all the time, just sort of like having an abundance of song, a really high output, is that beneficial? So it turns out that it seems like it is. There have been studies done where out in natural areas, scientists have supplemented mealworms they put them kind of out so that these birds could get them, and found that on the days where the birds got these mealworms, their output was higher than on the day before or the day after. So this suggests that if there is more food within their territory, if there's a higher abundance of food, they probably have to spend less time looking for food. They're also just getting more food, which translates into more energy, which means that they have more time to sing, and they also just have more energy to sing. And so this can end up affecting the reproductive timing So males that are sort of higher output males, in a lot of cases end up nesting earlier. And that can be beneficial if it's a species that has the potential to have more than one nest in the breeding season. So if they can start earlier, then they have the potential to raise more than one batch of young in that season. And then also in some cases, nests fail. And so if a particular pair has nested earlier, then they have a chance to re-nest and still have a successful batch during that breeding season. And then some cases, I think there's one more note and I can't see it because it's being blocked. But anyway, so, oh, I know. So females tend to choose males that sing more abundantly. And in some cases you get those males are actually end up producing more because they have extra pair copulations. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so is better better? If a bird is more adept at singing, does it have a better chance of finding a mate? So it turns out that even within one species, even if they're all singing the same song or a very similar song, the rate and pitch can vary between males, as can the consistency. And so how consistent it is kind of is a reflection of the bird's stamina and the bird's physical coordination. And so these things suggest that this is a mate that's worth choosing. So if a female is looking for a mate and there's a mate that is just a particularly good singer that actually is able to sort of coordinate its bill and its syrinx and its respiratory system and all of this and sing really well, that suggests that male is in good health. And then it also is sort of a signal to a would-be rival that they might want to avoid even challenging that bird because chances are it's in good physical health and it's going to be able to sort of stand its ground and keep that territory. So as I started to say, in some cases, you end up with extra pair copulations. And so studies have been done where these, you might have a male and a female that are socially mated, which means that and he is feeding her while she's incubating eggs, and both of them are going to help raise the young. But every now and then the female might mate with another male. And it turns out that most of these extra pair copulations happen with these neighborhood birds. You know, there might be another bird that's close by, another male, who's a particularly good singer or singing an abundance of songs during the day. And so they will end up basically passing on more genes that way. And then trills are really fast sort of movement between two notes. So it's a really quick sound that birds make. And in some cases, just as humans, we might hear a really melodic song and think, oh, that sounds complex and you know, that must be difficult to make. It turns out that these trills that can sound sort of simple because it's just kind of a like, you know, those are actually more difficult. And so as I was saying, it requires this amazing coordination between the bill, the syrinx, and the respiratory system to produce those sounds. So for instance, in orange-crowned warblers, like this photo here, their song is basically a trill. And in some cases, in some individuals, it's really fast. And it might go from a high note to a low note, a sort of descending pitch. And that is a little bit more difficult than staying on a steady trill. And if you listen to orange-crowned warblers, there is a lot of variation. Some are slower, some kind of barely drop down at the end, and then some are really quite impressive with just this amazing trill that shifts between these frequencies. Okay, so being heard. So birds are, you know, a lot of times in forests or in places with vegetation and trees and shrubs and things like that. And that can actually block sound. So a lot of birds will end up getting up into the top of trees or shrubs. And for instance, on the left here, you have the Pacific wren, and they spend a lot of time just down in the forest floors of like redwood forest, just sort of dark, moist forest. But in the morning, he will get up into the treetops, go all the way up and just sing this amazing song that seems to go on forever. And so that way, there isn't anything to sort of block the sound. It travels farther because he's up at a higher elevated perch. And same thing with things like spotted towhees that also spend a lot of time on the ground. The males will actually get up to a higher perch to sing. And that way, that sound isn't obstructed by things that are closer to the ground. And then birds have to compete with other nature sounds like crickets and cicadas and grasshoppers and things like that. So a lot of cases, if you have, let's say, grassland species, they might have to sing at a higher frequency just to be heard over the sound of these insects, for instance. And humans are really loud. We make a lot of noise. And I think that this last year, we all probably became very aware of that during the shutdown when things in our neighborhoods got really quiet, when traffic died down. But you think about in the normal hustle and bustle, and as we return to opening things back up, this spring was probably very different from last spring for the birds, because even in rural communities, you get just the sound of agricultural equipment, things like that. You get roadsides and traffic and freeways, and even just a high school arena can end up producing a lot of sound. And then, of course, things like airports. So all of these are sort of outside noises that these birds have to compete with. So they have a couple different ways that they can try to make themselves heard. And one is to adjust the time that they're singing. So as I mentioned, there's typically a dawn chorus. And in areas where, like especially around airports, birds will actually start singing the dawn chorus earlier than normal or than they would in another habitat, just to sort of get going and advertise a little bit before the sound of the airplanes really gets underway during the day. And then also in some cases, birds will adjust their volume. So let's say their territory is near a busy road. They're just going to have to compete with that all the time. And so they have to increase the volume that they're singing at. And then in some cases, they're adjusting their pitch. So they're just singing at a higher frequency to be heard over the sort of lower humdrum sounds that are going on in that environment. And white-crowned sparrows are a really great bird to look at because they've been studied so well. So white-crowned sparrows have a lot of different dialects, and a lot of birds have what are called dialects. The dialect is basically just it's a geographic clustering of bird vocalizations, meaning that within that area, the birds tend to sound similar. And if you were to go to a different area, the same species might have a little bit of a different sound to their song. And so here you can see these spectrograms where you don't worry about what all of this means, but you can see that Marin, just by the little dash lines, Marin is a little bit different from Berkeley, which is different from San Francisco. And then over on the right, you have a lot of different dialects in Point Reyes. So white-crowned sparrows have really been studied. And there was a study in San Francisco that has gone back to the 60s and 70s when Louis Baptista first started studying them and identified that there were a few different dialects. And over time, all but one of those dialects have gone extinct. So it's not that the birds have gone extinct, just those particular songs have gone extinct. And so only the San Francisco dialect has remained. So in 2015, you can see here, this one dialect was found, but it was sung at a higher frequency than it was in the 60s and 70s. So pretty much the same song, same dialect, but it was sung at a higher pitch to compensate for just how much louder the city had gotten over time. And the really interesting thing is last year, when everything quieted down, the people who are continuing to do these studies, it was a great opportunity to go out and see what the birds did when the city quieted down. And sure enough, kind of amazingly, but not surprisingly, they started singing differently. And so they were singing at a lower volume and a lower pitch. So it'll be curious to see what happens now that that humans have started to be more active, chances are they've kind of reverted back to the way they were singing prior to last year. Okay, so how do birds know what to sing? Some birds like flycatchers and pigeons and doves and quails, it's innate. Basically, they're born knowing their vocalization. They don't have to learn it. In the case of like flycatchers, even when the juveniles beg, it sounds a lot like the adult vocalization. And for instance, in common quail, which aren't here, but in common quail, there are two subspecies that are known to hybridize. And when they do, their vocalization is kind of an intermittent mix between those two subspecies. So yeah, you get these birds that just straight out of, the nest almost basically know what their song should be like or their vocalization. And then birds like hummingbirds aren't songbirds. Technically, none of these birds are technically songbirds. Hummingbirds do learn how to sing, as do songbirds. So songbirds make up about half of the world's birds, and they have to learn their songs. And a lot of times they've got these beautiful songs, but they actually have to learn them. And so vocal learning occurs in some animals, not very many, in mammals and in birds. And in mammals, it's humans, it's bats, and a few marine mammals like dolphins and whales. And then in birds, it's songbirds, hummingbirds, parrots, and bellbirds, which are from New Zealand. So they have to basically go through this process where they listen to an adult sing. And if you think about human speech development, you have a young kid, a toddler, who's listening to adults, and then they kind of start to babble, right? First, they kind of start to test out sounds, and then they start to learn a few words, and then they kind of practice those words until they get them right. So bird song development is very similar. So you have young that while they're still in the nest, they're probably hearing their father sing, they're hearing other males in the neighborhood sing. So they're starting to hear it. And then they go through what's called this sensitive period, where that's when they're kind of taking in this information, they're learning those songs, and then they have to memorize those songs. And then they start practicing them, kind of like a toddler babbling, right? So sometimes you'll see juvenile birds who have fledged, who have left their parents, kind of like muttering, sort of. They quietly are sort of singing this garble of sounds, and it's not really the adult song. And they're just kind of practicing. And then there have been some studies that suggest that they actually even do this in their sleep. So they practice, they hone their skills until it sounds just right, and then they crystallize it. And typically by the next spring, those songs are crystallized. And so they really don't work on improving that song after their first year. And then by the first spring, they're ready to establish their own territory and vocalize and sing the song they're going to sing for the rest of their lives. So in some birds, like I already mentioned, Buick's wrens and song sparrows, where you have each male has this whole repertoire of songs, and in some cases they're sharing songs with their neighbors. Sometimes what happens is the juveniles might start off with a couple songs that they've learned from their father or the males that were in the area they were born, and then once they disperse and start establishing their own territories, then they pick up some of their neighbors' songs. And then you have open-ended learners. And it's interesting, a lot of times we think of mockingbirds as being sort of the classic open-ended learner because they're mimics and they have these huge repertoires. A male have 200 different phrases that he sings. And it's thought that they continue to learn songs throughout their life, that it's not just through that first year. There's been a study that was done in North Carolina that kind of challenges that. And it'll be interesting to see what comes of that, if anything, if other studies are done. But somebody put out, had banded 15 adult birds over the course of time, was tracking them. And then for 6 months played recordings of sort of novel sounds that these birds didn't already have in their repertoire. And then he went to see if any of those sounds were picked up, and none of them were, which was sort of surprising. And then that prompted him to go back and sort of look at these birds he'd been following from when they were young to when they're older to see if there was much difference in their repertoire. And there actually wasn't. So in this one particular study, it suggests that perhaps they're not open-ended learners, but that has yet to be seen. But regardless, they are mimics. And a few different birds are mimics, mockingbirds, thrashers, even goldfinches and starlings. And mockingbirds, at least, are great. They will incorporate other sounds, including bird sounds and car alarms and tree frogs and all of that. And they'll mix that in with their mockingbird sounds. So it's kind of this mix of both, about half and half. And if there's a song that's particularly fast or at a higher frequency than the mockingbird can replicate, it will still sing that snippet of song. It will still do the same length as the original song that it's mimicking, but it'll sort of fake it for a couple notes. So it's kind of like if you were listening to the radio and you're singing along and then there's a phrase that you don't know and you just kind of like mumble or make up words. It's almost like the mockingbirds kind of do that when it's just too complex for it to mimic. But I love the fact that ultimately it's still maintaining the same sort of rhythm and length of that original song that it's mimicking. And then, as promised, we'll end on this note. The girl band. So there are, as I said, a lot of species of females that sing, or a lot of species of birds where the females sing. And we're just now finding out more about it because more people are doing studies on it. And I think historically there was this assumption that it was just the males that were singing, at least, like I said, in the Northern Hemisphere. In the Southern Hemisphere, there are a lot of females that sing. But here locally, we do have a handful that I'll just point out. And so here are a few. House wrens. And I should note that the female song is, in some cases, it's similar to the male song, but in a lot of cases, it's different. And sometimes it's only given in particular situations. So for instance, the house wren will vocalize, will sing in the early days of pairing up with the male. And so typically that's in response to the male singing. So the male will sing and then she'll respond just at first as they're sort of pairing up. And then, but if he begins to advertise again or court another female, then she'll start to sing more vigorously again. And in wren tits, they maintain their pair throughout the year. They stay on territory. They don't move around much. And they even, you know, in the winter, they're staying in contact with each other, which a lot of other birds are splitting up and then pairing up in the spring. So wren tits both sing. The male has, it sort of sounds like a bouncing ping pong ball with a trill at the end. And the female just sounds like a bouncing ping pong ball without the trill at the end. And warbling vireos, during courtship, the female will sing and they'll kind of do this sort of loose duet sometimes. Black-headed grosbeaks. So I should note that in these species, for the most part, the males and the females look pretty much the same. In the wren tit, the female has a pale eye and the male has a dark eye. But in black-headed grosbeaks, which again we have here, the male and female look pretty different. So here we've got the female on the left and the male on the right. And the female will, every now and then during the breeding season, she'll sing, and it's thought that it sort of keeps the male on guard. He might think that there's an intruder in his territory, and so he'll pay a little bit more attention to the female in the nest. And then once the young fledge, both of the male and the female will sing, and that's a way to help keep the family together, to sort of keep the young together as they're moving around. And Bollocks orioles, the male and the female look quite different. And early in the season, sort of during, before and during nest building, the female might actually sing more than the male during this time. And typically she's singing when she's down on the ground, and he's usually up on an elevated perch, like in a tree or something when he's singing. So she sings early on, and then that kind of tapers out. And so I will say Bollocks orioles are going to be leaving us soon. They kind of start to migrate again. They get on the move as early as June, and there's a significant drop by like August. So a lot of these birds are wrapping up their breeding season in the next month or so, and song will begin to taper off. So I would just encourage you to open up your windows, you know, sit outside in your yard or go take a walk and just really appreciate the energy and complexity that is behind every single bird voice that you hear. So
Okay, so with that, I just want to thank you all. Have fun listening to birds out in your gardens or in your walks. Be well, and we'll see you soon, we hope.
Great,
In
thank you
in
so much. That was wonderful.
Oh, you're
Thanks for
welcome.
tuning in, everyone.
You bet. Let's do it again soon.
Sounds good.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.